A great evening to discuss something that actually I have lots of investment myself into it. So before we go too much into it, I just want to say welcome to Massey College. Massey is built on Indigenous lands, the lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. It is actually the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit who have an office at Massey. And I think we want to acknowledge the great privilege that we have to continue to do our work here, but also, the duty that we have of stewardship toward this land. I'm particularly interested in the topic of tonight because most of my life has been in the human rights justice fight, which we want to own language. We want to language to represent what the suffering is all about. So it has been, if you're in the human rights fight, it's always about recapturing language and owning language so that it describes accurately what's happening. So I'm particularly interested tonight that it's called Watch Your Language. And so anyway, we always are very grateful to our journalism fellows to putting out this is a contribution to the intellectual journeys of the Massey community. And I think I want to say thank you for being here and come back. We're on a journey to continue to explore what it is to have a deliberative democracy that continues to be enlightened and vibrant. Merci beaucoup. Bonsoir.
Thank you, Natalie. My name is Michael Barclay. I'm a journalism fellow here this year. And I had some cold symptoms earlier. I'm going to keep my mask on. I tested negative twice. So we all know the windows are open. I think we're good. Thank you for joining us. This is the second event of the Journalism Fellows presenting what we call Press Club, where we discuss issues in the media. We have several very special guests with us. Joining us remotely from Washington, D.C., I believe, James McCarten from the Canadian Press, editor of the Canadian Press Style Guide, in charge of all copy editing decisions for Canadian Press, which of course affects much of the media landscape across the country. And he's been with CP for since 1994.
Correct.
And in charge of the Style Guide since 2010, is that correct?
Right, yeah.
To my left, your right, is Heather Mallick, who's been a columnist with the Toronto Star for 10 years, with stints at the CBC and the Globe and Mail before that. So she's worked at all the biggies in town, in the country. And at the far end there is Denise Balkissoon, who is currently at the Narwhal as of the last 6 months. And before that, at Chatelaine and Globe Mail, and also the Toronto Star before that. So she's also worked at all the biggies, of which the Narwhal will soon be one. So thank you to all our guests for joining us today. I should also say that I worked at Maclean's magazine from 2008 to 2017, where I was copy editing chief there. So all these decisions about changes in language and uses were part of my daily job. George Orwell wrote about politics in the English language. It could be argued that all language is political, not just when used for purposes of propaganda and political gain, but in social issues and everyday interactions, in something that was once as simple as pronouns. Language, like culture, evolves, usually for the better, sometimes toward the more imprecise and sometimes meaningless. I've been a professional writer for 30 years. I don't think I've witnessed as many changes to copy editing style and accepted usage of terms as I have in the last 10. Most have to do with identity, be it Indigenous or racialized communities or sexual minorities. I did some research today because I was trying to remember when certain things began to change. For example, the term LGBT. I didn't remember when that first surfaced on my radar or in the mainstream consciousness in general. From what I could tell, it was somewhere around 2007 when a US group used that language in lobbying for an anti-discrimination bill. And then as non-binary and genderqueer advocates had to grapple with the started becoming more prominent, copy editors had to grapple with grammatical implications of using they and them to apply to a single person. And in a copy editing office, that was quite fraught at the time. Barely anyone blinks an eye at they and them today, but it was 5 short years ago when that was still hotly contested in newsrooms. I could go on, but I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. There's also lists of words that have been held up for examination for other reasons. Some stigmatize mental health issues. Some stigmatize other illnesses. Some come with historical baggage that many users aren't even aware of. Most of these words are so common that few lay people think to even question them. But as writers and journalists, that's our job. We're well versed in synonyms, and we should be able to be well equipped to choose the right one as language evolves. So how do these discussions play out in newsrooms? That's what I want to discuss today. James, I want to throw to you first because as someone in charge of copy editing and a gatekeeper of sorts, copy editing is an inherently conservative position. Every day someone comes up and says, it should, no, really, it should be like this. And the copy editor's job is to say, no, it shouldn't. So I'm curious, when someone starts advocating for a change, how does that play for someone at your level in deciding when to change usage and terms?
Well, I mean, this whole area, and Michael, you summed it up really nicely, and so did George Orwell, really, as far as I'm concerned. But this whole world that we're sort of talking about tonight is it's definitely more complicated than it was 10 years ago. You know, to your specific question about one good example, say, is you mentioned LGBT. The acronym is longer now, right? And it can get even longer. And so very often what we will see sometimes is a reporter will come in, they'll be writing about LGBTQ issues. And they will have used the longer version of the acronym, which, you know, from our perspective is it has a couple of problems. Number one, not everyone knows what all of the letters and symbols mean. So, you know, my perspective on this has always been that there has to be a tension between the needs of the reader and the desires of, I guess you could say, the reporter, but really it's more about the subjects of the stories themselves, right? We are very much now in a place where we want to give more power to those people, to the voices in our stories, to dictate more about the terms, and when I say terms, I mean the boundaries around what they say and how we report what they say. We want them to have more of a say. But there is a limit. There has to be a limit because we know for a fact that not every reader that picks up that story is going to know what the 2S stands for, what the plus is supposed to mean. The other issue strictly from a wire service standpoint is that even now, believe it or not, this is a wire service that's more than 100 years old. We still can't deal with certain characters, right? So a plus sign can cause us problems because we have to cater to the kind of the most basic publishing system, copy management system that our clients have at the other end. And we have a lot of clients who have been around for a very long time and have very old systems. So it's a combination of practicalities from our standpoint, but also considering the needs of the reader. And so much of what we're talking about tonight has been incubated on social media. It's been amplified on social media. The growth and the change has been exponential because of social media, and not everybody is on social media. So we try to strike that balance when we come up with these sorts of decisions.
I want to ask the writers on the panel about times when there has been a new term or new usage that you've wanted to include into a story and you've received pushback. And can you recall any particular battles or instances where, like, have you ever thought about, is it too early? Again, with the reader in mind, because as writers, that is our primary goal, is to communicate effectively and make sure readers understand what we're talking about. Can you recall any time when you're like, should I use this? do I have to explain this? Do you have to be over-explaining when a new term comes into play?
I mean, I was on the Globe and Mail Style Committee,
Mhm.
and we actually had the they them conversation,
Mhm.
and it really took longer than I personally thought that it needed to. But I think I agree with James that you need to be aware of who your audience is, as well as who you want your audience to be. But you just explain it for a little bit of time, and yourself and the editor, it's 1 year, it's 2 years. After a while, you don't have to say who uses they them pronouns or something like that. You can just go straight to the pronoun. The LGBTQ plus is also interesting because there is the option of spelling the whole thing out the first time, and it does look very long on the page or on the screen. But that is how you communicate it to an audience, especially when it's new. So I think that there's a way to make a change and bring the audience along with you. And it might take something. I think also we tried to make our writing so clean and like elegant and whatever. And sometimes this can seem clunky, and none of us like that. But that might be necessary for new terms as well, because you can't just like throw it in the middle of something if you think that a big part of your audience isn't going to know what it means.
I'm curious about that style committee. And James, I don't know if you have a committee you work with or whether you're the boss. I worked at McLean's, where it's basically myself and one other person, so we just hash it out.
Mm-hmm.
James, do you have a committee that you work with, or do you call the shots?
Well, it depends on the issue. I mean, if it's something that's fairly benign, something that's fairly routine, then we can usually make relatively unilateral decisions. I mean, I usually run it up the flagpole with folks in the front office and make sure that everybody's on board before I do anything kind of on my own. If it's a little more substantive, if it requires a discussion, capitalizing Black is an example of that, then we'll throw it open to a much wider group, generally of managers. We often will bring in experts from outside to talk about a lot of these issues, the ones who advocate for certain changes, to get their perspective on why they want to see those changes. So it runs the gamut, really, in terms of how that works. And that is, I think, also something that's important to consider tonight, is that we don't have the resources that we did 20 or 30 years ago in terms of newsroom resources to sit and have these conversations the way we would like to. And I've been working in the wire service my entire career. And one of the first pieces of advice I ever got from anybody, Paul Woods, who was my first boss, was this. It's not as important for you to make the correct decision as it is for you to make a decision. Now, that doesn't necessarily apply to the style book, but it is good advice for anybody who works for the wire service. And I think now that's kind of the mode we're in, right? We have to press ahead, even though we can't necessarily, have a complete and really, really substantive discussion about a lot of these issues, at least from the perspective of the wire service.
Heather, do you want to talk about the Star? I mean, you've been at the Star for 10 years, and as I mentioned off the top, I feel like the last 10 years has been a period of extreme change.
Extreme change and extreme pain, yes.
Yeah. So how does that play out in the Star in terms of do the editors consult with you about copy issues? Do you push back? How does that work?
Well, I don't know. I'm in a kind of awkward position at the Star, in that my job is, I was brought in to be a singular voice at the Star, because we're a mainstream paper. Mainstream journalism is in a lot of trouble, and I was hired to be an interesting writer. And one of the things that I find, actually, it's been kind of enjoyable. The editors were furious, but my op-ed pieces are now 650 words. That's it. And so when I've written something I'm happy with, I then go through every word I've written, and I call it shaving. It's like having an electric shaver that you men use on your jawline. And I take out every extraneous word, because if it's over 650, my editors I'm very fond of my op-ed page editors, are going to have a difficult time. So when you I'll give you a not terribly troubling example, but if you want to say people experiencing homelessness, I can't do that. I can't have 650 words saying that over and over again. And the fact is, if you ask a person who's sleeping on the street, sir, are you experiencing homelessness? He's not going to say, yeah, I'm at this time, I am experiencing that. He's going to say, I don't have a home. So to me, a homeless person, someone who is homeless, that works for me. And that's because I have only 650 words. So my fight when I have new terms come in, and this is one thing I really notice, the new terms are always longer than the old terms. They're always a minimum of 3 words, where 1 word used to be useful. It's a real problem for me, and I have to cope with that. And I hear from that a lot. I'll give you another example that I probably shouldn't discuss because it's so fraught, but I'm rather fond of this one. Are there people with autism, or are they autistic? And one reason I mention this is because the battle has gone on between, I say it's between kids and their parents. Their parents will always say, children with autism. And when the children become teenagers, they go, no, look, I'm autistic. That's what I am, and you just have to accept that. And in the end, I went with autistic, the single word, because I felt the people who should have the last word on autism are those young kids who have a whole life ahead of them with a very difficult condition. And I thought that is compassionate, but it's also shorter. The fact is, if I wrote about that, I would get such blowback on Twitter, and editors pay far too much attention to Twitter, that the problem is I no longer write about subjects like autism, because the fight over 3 words, 1 word, pronouns, this and that is so difficult and so painful. It takes up all the oxygen in the room, and I have 1,000 other topics I can deal with. It makes me very sad that there's some subjects I no longer will write about. That's my dilemma.
Do you have more leeway as a columnist? Because I worked at Maclean's where there were columnists and there were reporters, and there were a couple of writers kind of blurred the two, kind of like personality or like well-known, people
Yeah,
who appear
Paul
on panels.
Wells, go ahead
Exactly.
and yeah.
Sure, but I mean, there were also, there's some writers who were, given a lot of fact-checking leeway that I won't get into right now. That's a whole other issue. But because they were columnists and they were a voice, and they were allowed to do what they want. But I remember at the time, Maclean's Andre Lemieux was a columnist, still is, I believe.
Yes.
Maclean's style at that time was not to capitalize Black, and Andre did. And he's a Black writer. I'm the copy editor. I'm not going to argue. So I felt like it changed in his column first before there was ever a wider discussion at the magazine. So I felt like columnists are one, perhaps, given more leeway that they can perhaps direct. I don't know, Denise, because Denise, you also wrote a column in the Globe, didn't you?
Yeah.
I mean, I said racialized very early because, the official Canadian government term is visible minorities, and and that one is tricky, right? Because whatever term the writer uses, if you want to use government stats, they're putting it as visible minorities. And it's so problematic in so many ways, like lumping so many groups of people together, et cetera. So I would always just use the language that I wanted. Capitalizing Black was also one that was just like far too many minutes of style committee meetings got used up on. But for myself as a columnist, I don't remember any specific words or terms ever being a problem. Because again, I would just I understand what you're saying about the economy of the words and how frustrating that can be sometimes. But my approach was always to just try and put your little definition in. And maybe I would do it the first 3 times that I used a term. And then I would just assume that people who were reading my column would get it. I don't ever remember getting too many questions about things either. Yeah. So I don't think I was being confusing.
Yeah, but do you think it was different, because you've done reporting as well? Do you think,
Yeah.
so I guess my question is, do you have more leeway as a columnist than you would if you were reporting? Is
Yeah,
there-
that's a good question. Like the visible minority one is that one that I would think still poses a problem for reporters because it's a term that you have to use if you're using the data. Other than that, I can't really think of it. I mean, I'm sure I would think that there would be, because there has not been a Black columnist ever at the Globe. I would think when they had like freelancers or guest columnists that they may have capped it and it may have been lowercase. But I don't know for sure.
Right. I was thinking about how, and James, you've been around since the 90s in this position. There's some terms that take and some don't. Like in the 90s in academic feminist circles, there's a movement to demasculinize the word woman and women. So the letter Y was used in place of the second vowel. That didn't really take on a broad scale. I don't think that's still used today, to the best of my knowledge. Whereas more recently, and maybe you mentioned maybe social media might drive this, but certain gendered words, particularly from romantic languages, French, Spanish, Italian. We were talking earlier about the term Latinx as opposed to Latina or Latino, or similar with Filipino or Filipina, the letter X being used. What do you think makes some terms take and some don't? Is it just that this discussion is accelerated on social media, or why?
Well, I mean, I think social media has had a huge role to play. And I think Heather's probably got a point when she says that editors pay too much attention to social media. I think all of us kind of do, in the sense that we tend to see it as representative when it's really not, right? But I don't know that we necessarily feel or know the extent to which it can be used as a proper barometer of where people are at. But one thing is for sure is that it definitely accelerates the pace at which these discussions take place. It accelerates it amplifies the pressure that people like me and people like Heather and Denise and everyone else who's in this business feels around these sorts of issues. And I think the difference there, well, I mean, I shouldn't speculate, but I certainly think that there was a certain amount of skepticism around that type of etymology, I guess, for lack of a better word, at the time. And now these things can kind of be compartmentalized. There can be communities of people that can have this conversation and they can decide that this is how they're going to spell the word and this is the term they're going to use, whatever that may be. And then that from there, that then takes on a different scale, right? And so, I mean, it definitely takes less time than it used to take, but I think part of this too is you know, in the 90s, newsrooms were still fairly robust. Certainly the style guide and the people who ran the style book when I first started, this would not be a conversation that they would have a lot of time for, quite honestly, because newsrooms had more clout. Newsrooms were still, I mean, generally speaking, the mainstream media still had a certain amount of influence. And there was still this very entrenched sense that we do things the way we're going to do them. We weren't as interested as we are these days in giving people the opportunity to dictate the terms that I was talking about earlier in terms of how they're reflected, how they're represented in the media. And I think that's one of the biggest differences now is we don't have as many legs to stand on as we did 20, 30 years ago, as far as the health of the industry, as far as being able to disregard certain discussions that we felt were silly or inconsequential. We are now, I think, in a position where we have to take more of that into account and consider it. You know, that's just sort of the way the industry is right now. I feel like that's a big part of this conversation, that newsrooms don't have as much leeway to push back on some of this stuff. And so there's been a bit of a sense of, okay, we're gonna try to bring more people into the tent, mainly because there's not a lot of barriers anymore, people manning those barricades that there were back in the 80s and 90s.
Well, I think also it's not just the audience or social media, it's the makeup of the newsroom. The makeup of the newsroom was probably more homogenous before, and now it's also people within the newsroom that would like, you know, for myself, again, to bring up one that is still sticking in my craw, like visible minorities is such a unuseful and really just irritating term to me. And I think, you know, in the 90s, I would assume that if someone were to try to say a different term or to use racialized, the copy editor response would be, well, the Canadian government uses visible minorities. And now my response would be, well, that's nice, and this is what I'm going to use. And so I think it's the makeup inside of the newsroom as well as the audience.
I mean, the Canadian government still has the Indian Act on the books, so
Right.
yes. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it was only with Trudeau that it changed from Department of Indian Affairs. Like those terms move very slowly on the federal level, so I feel like journalists are more likely to push it.
Can I say one thing, minor thing? Maybe the reason Latinx didn't catch on is because people read it as Latinx and it sounds silly. So if you're going to try and change a word, try and make it as plausible as possible and as difficult to misunderstand. The Guardian has, I think it's dropping it now, uses BIPOC, BIPOC. And to my mind as a Canadian, I always read it as bipolar people of color. And that's not good. And so I think if you're going to come up with a new word, it should be something you can link onto in some instant way, and that will catch on and be extremely effective. But I might be wrong about that. You know, Latinx, who knows?
Stick. I mean, for words about race and racism specifically, they all suck because racism is a terrible thing. And so an umbrella term for people from like every corner of the earth is always going to be insufficient. And so, I mean, it's the same with LGBTQ, you know, the goal is to be as specific as you can actually at all times, because I would think every umbrella term, like even outside of identity terms, they're just always insufficient.
Yes.
I was shocked that LGBT took. Like when it came out, it was like, this is terrible branding. Like who put these 4 letters together? And I understand the importance of it. I understand why it works. I also think the inclusion of the T transformed the entire conversation, because I feel like before LGBT was used as a term, trans issues were not on mainstream radar at all. So I recognize the political power of that letter in that acronym. At the same time, yeah, the 20 letters or whatever that have been appended to it makes it meaning. The more specific you make it, the more of a useless umbrella it is for me.
I think, Michael, one of the, if I can interrupt very quickly, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but just one point that strikes me, one of the, you know, on the issue of Latinx and also women spelled differently, and now LGBTQ, I think what's important about the terms that take, the ones that do catch on, is that they're accepted by those communities. They're embraced by those communities. I think it was in the New York Times recently where there was a story about how Latinx in the Latino community has not gained any traction whatsoever. They don't use it themselves, right? And I think that's one of the biggest, and you know, this is a problem with visible minorities as well, because when you use the term visible minorities or any of the other terms that we've used over the years, you are sending a pretty explicit signal that you're talking about someone else, right? You're talking about a different community, a community other than yourself. And so it's certainly not, it's obviously not a term that someone in a visible minority community is going to use themselves, right? And so I think part of the reason that a lot of the time you see these things fall away is because they're not considered acceptable by the community itself. And I think that's an important factor.
I mean, I was thinking too about the the debate over capital B black, which I won't waste any more of Denise's time on today. But as a copy editor, my concern was always consistency. And it's like, yes, absolutely. But then the issue of white and brown come up, and then what do you do? And then the more I read about it, I found Kwame Anthony Paya writing in the Atlantic saying maybe white people don't deserve to be lowercase. Like by lowercasing, you make that the norm, you make it like a neutral standard that everything else has to be distinguished from. And that's something I know, anyway.
So maybe everything should be capitalized. And then you know what happens? We end up with the German language. Germans are saying, let's simplify our language and let's not capitalize all our nouns.
We can hear from Germans later if you want.
Yes, okay, very good.
No, but I mean, yeah, a copy editing standard is to lowercase everything. I mean, you know, faculties, whatever, like that is kind of the standard.
And I generally love lowercasing everything.
Yeah.
Especially now, like the Ontario Ministry of
Right.
Mining, Natural Resources,
Yes.
and Urban Development, like forget it.
Yeah.
It's all lowercase.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think of time. Where's my time flagger? Because I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions. We have 20 minutes. We have 20 minutes. All right. I've been told that if you'd like to ask a question, to please come up to the microphone. You can think about it. I'm just going to ask a couple more questions, but I would just want to make sure you're thinking about it right now. Outside of sexual politics and racial politics, there's also there's a somewhat infamous in journalist circles article that circulated a couple of months ago that the CBC put out about words and phrases to avoid. And some of them were shocking to a lot of people because they didn't know the history of the term grandfathered, for example. Or I'm trying to think what the other ones were.
I have them right here.
Oh, you have them right there.
Yes.
Brainstorm.
Oh, and blind.
Blind. Spook was one which really bothered me because I felt like the use predated and postdated its use as a racial epithet. And I also feel like unless you were a racist person in the 1940s, I'm not sure that term would even mean anything. But in terms of the kind of ableist discussion, uses of words like spastic was not on their list, but that's one that's come up a lot. Is it just is it a lack of imagination on writers' part when we continue to use old words maybe we shouldn't, or are there some words that exist outside of their historical concept or context and are just accepted parts of the English language and we're burdening them with this baggage? What do you, anyone?
Well, I thought they were absolutely right about sell someone down the river. That seemed to be specifically about slavery, and that appalled me, and I will never use that phrase again. And also, I'm not sure grandfathered really does sound, it sounds so plausible, yet if that is its historical meaning, yeah, I don't like that. On the other hand, I kind of draw the line at not being told I can't use the word blind. Because on Twitter today, a blind man was actually told, he was coming to a conference, you must describe yourself as somebody, was it suffering from sight loss, something like that. And he said, I'm blind. It's not, we don't call it sight loss. This is what I am. There was, and blackmail, anything with the word black in it, Churchill's black dog, black spot, just anything with the word black in it. And, you know, there was a huge library of words with the word black in it. Frequently, my mood is black. And I wonder about that one. So I don't know. I'm open to suggestions from the audience.
I mean, we have burdened black and white with these racial constructions, and that's our own fault. But I mean, and not that black and white are even colors. You know, you read any.
That's what they, yeah.
One is the absence of color, and one is well, actually, both are arguably the absence of color. Yeah, I mean, is it feasible to rewire the history of the English language based on our own stupidly racist behavior?
I just checked before I got here what blackmail means, and the OED says It's a tribute, say it in a Scottish accent, a tribute levied by freebooting Scottish chiefs in return for protection or immunity from plunder. And I don't know if you want to take away the word blackmail, if that's where it came from, just a bunch of Scottish people having a quarrel as they usually do. It seems innocuous to me.
What are you saying about Scottish people?
I'm saying a lot of things about Scottish people, and don't get me started. My mom is Scottish. So I don't know. Black as something that should be removed. I'm not sure.
I mean, I actually come down on, you can use whatever word you like as long as you're willing to defend it.
Yeah.
Because I think as much as it upset all the copy editors of the world, I think at least right now, things have to be able to be different. Like, so for example, I had asked an Indigenous academic I know, what do we do when people have a different spelling of Ojibwe? Because some people have an Ojibwe with an Y and with an E or an A. And, you know, especially because that's a word that it's a colonial term and it's from a language that has been tried to be erased, that actually whatever usage the person uses is the right one. And that means that maybe within the same story, let alone the same publication, there are going to be different spellings in the same word. And that definitely drives the copy editor in me bananas. But it's, I think, the right approach, because who am I to say how to spell Ojibwe? And so I actually think you can use whatever word you want, but if someone takes issue with it, you also have to be prepared for that.
I recall at Maclean's, we had an interview with Buffy St. Marie where she used the word squaw in context entirely. And then we got angry letters and we're like, I don't want to argue with Buffy St. Marie.
Yeah, she can say it.
Yeah. Before we go to questions, I also just want to point out that fascists love this discussion, and they love that we're having this discussion because it allows them to polarize the electorate and the populace, and like they love to point at discussions like this as an example of the weakness of the so-called left or the intellectual elite, and they want to make everything as simple as possible, and this discussion becomes a culture war politically. There's a lot of responsibility that goes with that. And I feel like airing our dirty laundry, I don't know, it's not damaging, it's necessary. We need to have these discussions, but I worry about how politicized it get. How do we move language forward without it turning into a wedge issue?
Maybe the trick is not to be offended. This is a weird thing. I am rarely offended. Even if I see something that I should be offended by, I tend not to take offense at it. And as for capitalizing Black and capitalizing white, I am half Scottish, half Indian. And I have always thought quietly to myself, sometimes not so quietly, well, just call me off-white. I'm okay with that. Like, I'm not going to be offended if you call me that because it's accurate. Now, I think I'm alone in the world and not getting offended by things nowadays, but I don't. And the thing about social media, everyone is offended all the time by the tiniest thread of language. And I think then the fascists are winning in that we're at each other's throats, and that's a very bad thing.
James, do you think these become wedge issues politically?
For sure. Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And you know, that's part of the reason why our approach in a lot of these issues, particularly around when writing about race and ethnicity or disability, mental illness, pick the sensitive subject, which is how we describe them. We have really, and the style book has never been a particularly prescriptive style guide. It's always been about trying to give people sort of parameters, give them guardrails and the tools to maybe make an informed decision about how they want to approach a particular phrase or term or what have you. Obviously, there is a fair bit of use this, don't use that in the book, but in terms of these types of subjects, we always try to make it make the reader, the user, aware of the perils, aware of the reasons, and whether or not those are good reasons for needing to take care, and then push them out of the nest and off they go. One of the things that the latest edition does on the subject of race and ethnicity, we've talked about visible minorities, we've talked about racialized, we've talked about BIPOC, is to kind of include all of those terms, explain the context behind them, explain where they crop up. For instance, visible minorities is a bureaucratic term that the federal government uses very often, particularly when it comes to census data. But when it comes to political communications from the Liberal government, come from the Prime Minister's office, his speeches, his releases and whatnot, it's now almost always racialized. That seems to be their preferred term. It's just not the term that the bureaucracy is using. That's because it's a political term. And it is very much a political discussion. He's using that intentionally to signal, and some would say virtue signal, that he's live to these sorts of questions. So if we were to go and say, okay, well, we've decided we're going to use racialized in all of our stories, then we've obviously created a situation where we're going to be accused of taking a position on the political spectrum, which is an accusation that CP, of all the things that we try to guard against, that's pretty paramount for us. We try to be, even in the context of journalistic organizations in Canada, we try to be as neutral as we can be. So I think you have to provide people the tools. I think you have to put the options on the table. And to Denise's point, you have to, and I think this is kind of one of the overarching principles for us, is you have to find out what the preferences of the people that you're writing about are, and follow those as your North Star. And it's only when you can't do that for whatever reason that you have to find another solution. But there's no doubt about it. It's politically fraught territory for sure.
I mean, everything is a wedge issue right now. And so for me, the question is like, who is trying to make this a wedge issue? And how can I be true to my own writing and my own thoughts while not playing someone else's game, I guess. But it's really quite difficult. Like we were talking at dinner, about like who is an anti-vaxxer. Like there are actually very many fine gradations within that. And so I guess I'm just always trying to show that it's complicated. It's actually not that simple at all.
Yeah. People don't want complicated things. They want answers.
It takes more words.
It does take more words. Why don't we throw, if anybody has any questions, please come up here and look very important at this podium and ask them. Sorry? Talk to the tech people. I'm not in charge of that.
That's a wonderful answer. Brilliant.
Okay.
Hello. Oh, can I be heard right now?
We can hear you. That's for everyone else.
Thanks for all of your perspectives. I have a question here on the little notes app. Because I would like a bit more clarification on what you meant by, there was a lot of reference here to social media, which as with any space is incredibly from authors to fellow journalists to editors and other lurkers. And I heard a lot of passive voice about feeling pressured or being told of, and I would just like a little bit more clarification about where this pressure and critique is coming from. Is it from fellow creators or readers? Because in reference, for example, to the reception of how people might from Central and Latin America, Latin America might interpret certain labels about them, that they're also on social media and within that a diverse group too. So in your experience, where has most of this social media pressure to conform to certain language norms actually come from? If you could clarify. Thanks.
I'm going to guess Twitter.
Yeah, it just turns out for some reason, most media people are on Twitter. That's probably the place where I get most of my reaction. Although I will tell you, if you want to be on Twitter, block and mute, and you can block words. If something is particularly abusive, just go to their little safety section, block words, and you need never hear it again. But for me, it's Twitter. Is it other things for you? Because for younger people, it's TikTok right now. I don't know how it lasts.
I am actually not on TikTok. Let's see, once I got verified on Twitter, I got a lot less garbage. So that was nice. And I like to think that I've put myself at a remove. I don't get into too many flame wars, you know, look how old that term is. There's a new term for you. Yeah, I don't know, like the question of who is actually on social is a really good one, right? And I think these past couple of weeks, especially since the war in Ukraine started, like it is so strange out there, you know, like 300 people with different numbers on their names are adding me every day. I don't know. I actually haven't gotten that upset at social recently. I think also I'm not a columnist anymore, you know, and I'm not a columnist for a reason, which is that I didn't like the hate mail, and I didn't like, you know, there are people that are constantly trying to argue, and when you are trying to make a good faith sort of discussion point, and it just gets bombed on, it was just not accomplishing what I wanted. So I don't have that many problems on social anymore. So
I think,
yeah.
I'm wondering if James has an answer to that question in terms of your earlier comment about how editors pay too much attention to Twitter. I don't know if that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think maybe I'll take a more, I don't know if metaphysical is the right word, but approach to the question, which is, yeah, Twitter obviously is a big one. Facebook seems to be kind of picking up steam, but I don't think those are necessarily the sources of the pressure itself. I think the pressure is self-imposed. I think the fear of being canceled, right? Of something that you say or do catching fire online and then going viral. And then the next thing you know, you're having a conversation with your editor-in-chief or the publisher or whatever. And you've suddenly gone down this rabbit hole where, you know, you did something that could potentially get you fired, even though you didn't know that it could, because the parameters seem to be constantly changing. I feel like in a lot of cases, because again, we've acknowledged this, right? Social media is not representative of the public at large. It's not necessarily, I mean, it's a bit like I tend to think of it as the bad guys in old horror movies. If you stop believing in it, their power over you goes away. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And if you can ignore it, then it's not a problem. The problem is you might be able to ignore it, and I ignore it with impunity, as it sounds like Denise does as well. And that's great, but you know, I work for a whole bunch of people, some of whom may have a different attitude because they have to worry about the brand. They have to worry about the media outlet's reputation in this world. And, you know, the fact of the matter is that this stuff, it wouldn't generate a story in another, hypothetically, suppose we did something dumb at CP and it caught fire on the internet. It takes a lot for another media outlet to say, okay, you know what, we're going to do a story on this. But by the time that happens, believe me, online, it's already, I mean, it's already a 5-alarm fire. So there's a real power there, whatever is behind it. I think a lot of it is sort of somewhat imagined, but it still has a real effect. And it's a chill, really, at the end of the day. And that's kind of where we're at.
I'm going to try to find a question somewhere in this. I could have chosen a million things, but correct on the question of racialized versus visible minority. I mean, anybody who's ever been a party to a federally administered contract knows that you have to do a certain amount of reporting um, under the principles of the Federal Employment Equity Act, which it was the first place where the term visible minority was used in a piece of legislation, and which actually defined visible minorities or included them as one of 4 categories of people who had to be reported, groups that had to be reported if you were an employer. And those 4 categories were women, indigenous people, disabled people, or as the act says, people with disabilities, and visible minorities. That's the place where, that's the source of every bureaucratic memo that uses the term visible minorities. That's where it comes from. And that being the case, I don't think there's an argument against using some other term, such as racialized, anywhere other than in a story about the Federal Employment Equity Act. You know, and I think probably if people knew a little bit more about that history, they would be less uptight about substituting something for the term visible minority. It doesn't really matter what a bureaucrat who's never heard of that history says. You know, you're actually trying to describe reality, not live in the brain of, you know, some director general of something. So I'm kind of, you know, and the larger point is, or the larger question is, are we tying ourselves up in knots a little bit too much? Are we kind of, is there a failure of nerve here? You know, Michael, you talked about, James particularly talked about the declining power or declining authority of news media. And I kind of wonder, having, you know, been there through this whole period, and having realized that authority existed, but never really feeling like I was wielding it, or the people I was working with were wielding it consciously. We were just trying to describe the world. And if it happened that we were using terms that, you know, that rang true, or that people considered had some authority, well, okay, that's fine. It's not going to change the way I'm doing my job, or the calls that I'm making, because I'm trying to call it as I see it, using the vocabulary that I know, not all of which, by the way, was right or was vocabulary that I would use today. I just wonder if there's failure of nerve here, and if what we really need is a little bit more spine, rather than a whole lot of, you know, a whole lot of kind of worry about, as James said, fear. What are we afraid of? I mean, are we really afraid? Are you really afraid of being fired because you used a word that was descriptive, or that you used language honestly in a way that, you know, really was, you know, was the best language you could come up with at the time? And I also kind of think there's, you know, a little bit too much forelock tugging among journalists, that we've gotten to the point where, you know, we kind of really, we're not sure of ourselves. And I think that that's also underlies some of these discussions. And I wonder if, you know, the panelists in some small way or in a larger way would share a little bit of that opinion.
I can certainly say that, yeah, to a large degree. I mean, in terms of having the courage, the sort of the backbone to push back on a lot of this stuff. I think the issue that the way I see it, at least, is that, you know, we needed that 10, 15 years ago when this was starting. And I can promise you that there was pushback at the time, right? And every one of the outlets that's represented on the stage tonight, every one of the major outlets in Canada and around the world has pushed back to certain degrees against some of this stuff. But there is also going to be a lot of the time a pretty compelling argument. That's one of the things about this that can be so insidious, is that while it may be the discussion may be surrounded by trolls and ne'er-do-wells who are just in this to kind of stir up a fight and get someone in trouble, there's often a nucleus of truth at the core, where there is one person or a group of people who have a legitimate concern about the use of a particular term or what have you. Which takes me back to what I was saying before about how we've tried to make our sections a bit more accommodating of different perspectives. You know, we talked a little bit earlier about autism, autistic versus people with autism, identity first, or identity forward language, person forward language. And it goes both ways. There are people out there who prefer to identify as autistic, in some cases even with a capital A, in the same way that some people who are deaf choose to embrace that as one of the defining characteristics of their personality. And then there are others who don't. And so you have to be in a position to say, well, you have to find out from the person, right? I think the answer to a lot of these questions does lie in what the individuals themselves have to say. I think we have to put them in the driver's seat in terms of dictating some of these things, and make that ultimately the arbiter of what it is we're trying to do. I just feel like in terms of pushing back on a lot of this stuff, the opportunity has passed us by a little bit. We are no longer in a position to do that. It feels to me like we are now kind of keeping our heads down and waiting for this storm to pass, in the sense that maybe social media won't continue to exist in the way that it does now, and we can kind of get back to a saner place. Knock on wood, right? Let's hope that happens, but who's to say that that's what's going to happen? But I do feel like maybe we've missed an opportunity here to prevent some of this damage from taking place.
If I may, I'd like to step back from political correctness for a moment and just address correctness. I have two examples. One, I've noticed that some publications no longer italicize titles of books and movies. So we don't know whether Erin Brockovich is the movie or the woman. But more seriously, I'm concerned about the misuse of words that, because they're being used over and over again badly, then take on the wrong meaning. A couple of years ago, the Globe Mail had a headline, "Christian Doctors Protest Policy." I actually wrote to Sylvia Stead, the public editor, and said, wait a minute. Christian is a set. Perhaps they meant the subset fundamentalist Christian doctors. And she agreed with me. But why are some people misappropriating the word Christian? I'd like everyone to comment, and particularly Mr. McCarten, because this is these are stylistic issues.
Sorry, is that a large insect? What was that sound?
Yeah. That was my heart racing as I contemplated answering this question, because it's not an easy one, and I have to admit that my answer to this is always, and I'm not telling anybody there anything they don't already know, right? The language evolves, the language moves around, and I think they're just, and this goes back to what we were saying earlier too, in the sense that how much control do we really have over these things? This is an industry, this is a business that takes a certain amount of pride in using the language properly, or at least tries to. And we've all been, I hope we've all worked for editors in our younger days who would call us out when we thought we were using a word correctly, but we weren't. Problem solved, right? Damage prevented. And that's getting harder and harder to do, for sure. I don't think ultimately though we're the problem. And this, again, it takes me back to social media. where you see language, you see words being used in all kinds of different ways. Sometimes they're being sort of reappropriated in an intentional way to deliver some kind of ironic or clever meaning. Other times they're just being used wrong. But there's still that usage then sort of picks up steam in other places, and really before you know it, and I'm telling you, this happens so fast. The last 10 years have just been a blur as far as a lot of these things transpiring. Next thing you know, the word is literally now defined in the dictionary in more than one way, including the new way. Fulsome is probably the classic example of this, where now I mean, I'm not sure that I've ever heard the word fulsome used in its original context in a proper way, but I hear it almost on a daily basis to mean complete or, full, filled out, because you can understand why that sort of bastardization would happen. But it is the way we use the language. It is the way the language almost is designed to be used, I think. I think if the word makes more sense to the person who wants to use it, if it trips out of the mouth or out of the thumbs in this case, and makes sense in the context that the person thinks it does, they can almost make it so. And certainly me, I can rail until I'm blue in the face about how these words should be defined and how they should be used properly. But we're up against a firestorm of power here that is reshaping the language literally in real time as we watch it happen. And there's only so much we can do about that, unfortunately.
So I want to take issue with the unfortunately aspect of this, which is, so I was part of the feminist movement in the 80s and the 90s, where we redefined lots of languages from victims to survivors, and then embraced the idea that language mattered, and that as you reclaimed language, as you wanted to own it, it actually had lots of political force. So language was always political, and it was always designed to be political. So the idea that, to me, I think it's fabulous that people would be debating, and that, people would use language and been being called off or called on and said, pourquoi pas? Why this? So why is it that there is a resistance or an idea that it should not, that we should not engage with this politicization of the language that you use, that we all use? To me, I think it's fabulous if there's a standardization that is being debated and being challenged. That means people are saying that's wrong. It's not the language, and I think you agreed with that earlier on when you said, if it does not reflect the experience of the user or the person for whom you're trying to describe their story, and they're saying that's not the language that I want to use about describing my own story, then that's the wrong language to use. So I think as we accept that framework, it might mean that language will evolve constantly, and maybe we should just be accepting and actually celebrating this. Yeah. Maybe you have to put in brackets the fact that this is a change, or this you may want to provide some context, but why not celebrate that change as opposed to resist it or feel a bit threatened by this? I mean, I say this as someone who's been in the academic world, where every time I've been challenged on the words I've used, and every feminist organization comes, you start your speech and people say, the first 15 words are the wrong ones that you should use. So the academic world is used to that constant challenge of language as being a powerful entry into discussion. And I'm just saying, why is it that it's threatening to the world of the press? Is my question.
Quite simply because it makes it, when I say unfortunately, I mean unfortunately for me, because it just makes my job harder, right? Because it's a moving target and it's moving much more quickly. And I think expectations of style books tend to be that they are rocks of Gibraltar, right? This is the thing that I'm going to refer to and it's going to have the answers for me. And very often what I have to tell people is that there is no right answer. You know, sometimes the best answer, they very often want to know, is it X or is it Y? And what I often tell them is, well, technically, from a grammatical standpoint, it might be Y, but the truth is the best sentence would write around that issue so that you go to Z and you just reframe the entire thing and get around that thing that you don't like, you know, an apostrophe on a word that you're not 100% sure is there. Like for me, those types of things are always red flags in the sense that you could write this sentence more clearly. You could reframe it and it would be more elegant. So it's very much a selfish perspective, but there it is.
There's some very good things happening with language. And one thing that feminism, I think, at one point did wrong was draining language of meaning and using phrases like intimate partner violence. I don't even know what that is. The great new word that is so descriptive and so helpful now is femicide. And I'm glad we're talking more about femicide because it is happening so often. It's on the increase. That's a marvelous and useful and comprehensible word. So a vote for word change, I'm for that in many cases.
I'm told we have an online question we want. Are you going to read that, Emily? What's happening?
It's on the.
Oh, I'm reading it.
Mhm.
Michelle H asks, since canceling has been mentioned, so here we go. This might be another half hour. How do you consider canceling versus being held accountable? How might the public react to journalists' work in a way that is productive? Well, don't call us names. That's one thing. Anyone?
I found the question a bit amorphous.
Right. So you're criticizing the question.
How can you respond to anyone's work in a way that is productive? First of all, it has to be in good faith. And the idea of canceling is that it's not in good faith. I also don't think that it happens in the way that it is often said to happen. But I think for the journalist, the job is to figure out when someone is in good faith, even if they can't express it super clearly, and then to let the rest of it roll off your back, which is not always easy, because sometimes even if it does roll off your back, as James said, it does not roll off your boss's back. But you know, if someone has constructive criticism, then that is something to be engaged with. And I think you just have a personal sense of if that's what's coming at you or not.
I do find that question a bit binary. I feel like you're not either held accountable or you're canceled. It's like journalists are held accountable all the time. I think. Readers.
No?
Much recent New York Times canceled. What happened?
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, when we first came up with this idea as journalism fellows and we thought about it, I think part of the big debate for us was like, when are we making progress and making our language better, and when are we policing? And like, when does this become like, and it really originated in many ways from this list that I think that Heather has about all these new terms that were like, we shouldn't use them anymore. And there were some of them were like obvious, like I would never use the word ghetto anyway, but then there was things like brainstorm and all these sort of things. And I guess my question that to you guys, and actually to any of the journalists in the room, have you had an experience where you're like, because I think Denise, you said it really well, and I really like what you said. It's like, you should use whatever language you want to use as long as you feel that you can defend it. And but then it comes to like a style guide and a style chief. So I'm wondering if, like, as journalists in this room, if we've had an experience where, I mean, I have, but I'll open it up, like where you wanted to use something and somebody told you, no, that's not in the style guide, and you felt like that was unproductive, against the meaning, not progress, whatever, like that you had an experience. I didn't know the panel or anything.
I have certainly had that happen to me.
Do you want to tell us about it?
No, I'd best not.
Later, when the mic's on.
Yeah, sure. I love all my editors very much. They're great guys. But sometimes I have felt traduced. And it was not happy for me.
You're looking for specific words? You're
I
like,
just feel like this whole idea of feeling police, which I think was like the fear behind part of behind the reason we did this, is that like at what point do you just start policing people's language, and at what point are we like being respectful and progressive, and you know, all these sort of things, in which part are we policing? So I'm wondering if like pardon me? What's your example? Oh, I don't know. It was Palestine related, so
I can give you an example. It's very inoffensive, and it's not really doesn't really quite fit with the whole sort of idea of offensive language. But it does, I think, speak to the fact that we do get called out by readers sometimes, and subjects on the use of language. We use it in good faith, and then we discover that it's being interpreted in a different way. I've done, this has happened to me now, I don't know, probably a couple of times in the last 6 or 7 years. The first time was entirely innocent. The second time was sort of a lapse in judgment. But I used the term so-called to refer to something, I can't remember what, I'm sorry, but a kind of a fanciful proper name that had been given to a program or some sort of scheme that I was writing about. And my meaning was that it had been given this name by the people who had come up with it, right? That they had kind of christened it this way. It's sort of dubbed, I suppose, would be another example, which is used a lot in newspapers. But the readers, at least this particular reader, read it as dismissive, right? As me saying, oh, that my so-called life, right, is the example. But I had not ever understood the term. At least I had always understood the term to have both meanings, that you could simply use it in a generic way to describe something that had been given a sort of a casual off-the-cuff name that had stuck, as well as, striking that dismissive tone. I've done it a couple of times because it's, for whatever reason, it's stuck in my brain that way. It's how I kind of grew up hearing the term. And it is, at least to me, it's now taken on an entirely different meaning, and it's verboten. At least in the way that I would typically use it. I would never use it in a news story in the dismissive way that I think readers have read it. I thought I was using it in a different way. And so I guess that if that speaks to anything, it speaks to the fact that we do respond to that kind of criticism. We do, and anybody in this business who's ever been called on the carpet by a reader or by an editor knows that. I mean, we go home and we put on the hair shirt and we self-flagellate for 3 days. This is important to us, right? This is very serious stuff, and whenever you encounter that, it stays with you for a while. So, I mean, that's the best example I could come up with.
I think that's a good one though, because there were a lot of news stories using it with the Freedom Convoy, the so-called Freedom Convoy, and I thought it was an interesting choice.
I got corrected to so-called Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. I would put Islamic State, they would say so-called. And I was like, what is that? But I would have it edited into my story. So-called. Like, what does that mean?
Well, I think with the Freedom Convoy, it's that you are questioning their labeling.
Or self-labeled. Why don't we just say self-labeled?
Right, which is, I guess, the problem that James got.
Self-described is what would come to mind for me.
Yeah.
It's negotiated. We always negotiated with the reader what the meaning should be, and that's a good thing to be called upon to say, is that what you really meant? Are you really conveying the complete essence of what you mean? I mean, we all are. Everybody that's writing has always been pressured in that way, you know, which, I mean, it's more difficult as journalists because it's a daily endeavor.
Well, I was going to say about academics too, if I can say this, you all have a lot more words to work with than we do. So you can like
Maybe not.
wrestle with the meaning of the word a lot more.
And you can put notes.
Mhm.
I agree.
I think we're going to wrap it there, says the rapping lady with the signal. Anyway, we're done. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for coming under all current shit shows. We will be gathering in the junior common room for refreshments, beverages. Okay. Thank you to Heather Mallick. Thank you to Denise Balkissoon. Thank you all for your questions. My name is Michael Barclay, and we'll see you over there. Thank you for watching online.
Bye, Diane.